Hello, welcome once again to In Search of St. Paul. This is the fourth and final presentation in the series about St. Paul. I promise that this time there will not be 5 test runs that take place before go time. I intend to delete those from the third presentation so that it's a little cleaner. I apologize for that. I don't have my videographers. I don't have Dave Taylor and his trusty cohort, Dick Costco, to help me. I've said it before. I studied theology, not technology. That's my only excuse. So, alright, so in weeks 1, 2, and 3, we have talked about the difference between real Paul or radical Paul and conservative and reactionary Paul, okay? And the basis of that was on the letters of Paul that are considered real, that are considered genuine, and those which are considered either questionable or almost certainly, and really certainly, not written in Paul's hand. We then also have talked about how the depiction of Paul in the Acts of the Apostles, which was written by the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke, is different than the way Paul depicts himself in his own letters. And so, if we want to look at the real Paul, the place to look is really in his own letters more than in the Acts of the Apostles. It's not as if the Acts of the Apostles are worthless, but it's always important to keep in mind that they give a very different view of Paul, a view that Paul himself disagrees with at times in his own letters. So today, and this is going to be a rather theologically focused talk. We're going to talk about the Jewishness of Paul. What I mean by that is, in what ways, even though he was a Christian, in what ways was Paul always a Jew? That's the point, the fundamental point, the thesis of what I'm going to say this today, is that Paul was a Jew who converted from one kind of Judaism to another. He converted to Christianity. He was a Christian Jew, but at the end of the day, he always remained Jewish. That doesn't invalidate or mitigate his message. It merely puts it, I think, in a context that's more understandable, makes more sense, and also is more consistent with the message of Jesus. At the end of the day, I believe that Paul was a very faithful interpreter of Jesus' message. That's not something that I believed for a long time. I saw Paul as someone who kind of distorted the message of Jesus. And in some ways he did change it. The message of Jesus evolved through the letters of Paul. But at the end of the day, I think the core of the message in Paul is consistent with that of Jesus. And I'll try to show you that today. So, what does it mean to say that Paul lived and died a Jew? It means that, as I've already said, even though Paul became a Christian, he never gave up his Jewish faith. So, with this in mind, we have to interpret Paul's letters with the understanding that he was always a Jew. And to specify that even more, he was what is known as a Hellenistic Jew, which means that his Judaism was influenced by Greek ideas. Remember that Alexander the Great had conquered Israel in the year 322 BCE, 322 years before the time of Christ. And the Jewish people became enamored with and quite fluent in the ideas and the language of the Greeks, to the point where around the second century before Christ, they actually had to translate their own scriptures, their own Torah, into Greek, the Septuagint. So, Paul, being a Hellenistic Jew, would have been heavily influenced by Greek ideas. To specify it even more, Paul was a Second Temple Jew. He belonged to the late period of Second Temple Judaism. Second Temple Judaism runs from about the year 515 BCE, 515 or so years before the time of Christ, to 70 CE or 70 AD, 70 years after the birth of Christ. We all know that what happened in 70 AD was destruction of the temple. The temple was never rebuilt after that time. The temple had been destroyed by the enemies of Judea when they took them into exile, and then it was rebuilt after they returned, after King Cyrus allowed them to return to their homeland. They rebuilt the temple. It was a magnificent structure, but then it was destroyed again by the Romans in 70 CE. So Paul is a part of that late Second Temple Judaism, and also a Hellenistic Jew. Easy so far, right? Sorry to be this technical, but it helps us to place Paul in his proper context. Okay. Why is it important for us to deal with this question of Paul's Jewishness? Among other things, it allows us to overcome what appear to be either inconsistencies or even contradictions in Paul's message. And it also allows us to do away with the very anti-Semitic interpretation of Paul that evolved over the centuries. Paul was not an anti-Semite. Paul did not reject Judaism because of his experience on the road to Damascus. But his writings and his person came to be seen that way. We will see that that is an error in the way to understand Paul. Okay, so let's begin with this. How did Paul become a Christian in the first place? Who Christianized Paul? Well, as we know from both the Acts of the Apostles and from Paul's own letters, his Christianizing experience began with the experience on the road to Damascus. And the way that experience came to be understood and came to be interpreted was that in that moment, Paul was converted from Judaism to Christianity, that he rejected the Judaism of his past and embraced Christianity, that he moved from being a sinner, a persecutor of Christians, to a saint. And this paradigm, this model of Jew to Christian and sinner to saint became the model or paradigm of all Christian conversion. Okay? So the Damascus story came to be interpreted to mean that when Paul had this experience, he utterly rejected Judaism and utterly embraced Christianity. To add fuel to that fire of Paul's sudden conversion was the fact that after his conversion, the Jews turned against him. We see that particularly in the Acts of the Apostles. So that the persecutor of Jews became the one who was persecuted by Jews. So that's the initial way we should understand Paul's conversion experience, if you want to call it that. I'll go into what it really was rather than a conversion in a little while. Let's put that on hold. Let's fast forward now to the mid-4th and early 5th centuries, and to the great theologian of early Christianity, St. Augustine. St. Augustine took the Damascus experience even farther, okay? It was Augustine who kind of solidified the perception of Paul as a convert. And as a matter of fact, Paul's, quote, conversion became one of the keys to Augustine's theology. And why is that? And it's because Augustine himself saw in the conversion of Paul a model of his own experience. St. Augustine, for the first 25 years or so of his life, lived, let's just say he lived a rather, he experienced a lot of things. Let's just put it that way, okay? And he experimented with different philosophical schools. He experimented with a number of different ideas, not knowing what he should be. And finally, he was converted to Christianity. The story in his Confessions is somewhat legendary, but still, he converted from his paganism to Christianity. And he saw in Paul's experience on the way to Damascus an example, a model, a paradigm for his own experience. And so in so doing, Augustine kind of personalized the experience of Paul and said that each individual somehow undergoes his or her own conversion experience. The theologian Pamela Eisenbaum says this: the fusion Augustine created between himself and Paul became the standard by which future religious experience in Western Christianity would be measured. So Augustine's, and by implication Paul's, experience became critical to the self-understanding of Christians, okay? Conversion became a critical component of Christian experience, even though by the time of Augustine, the majority of Christians were Christians by birth, not by conversion. Still, this conversion experience, this turning around from sinfulness and evil to Christ, became paradigmatic for the church. It's a real oddity because, as I said already, most Christians by this time, by the middle of the 4th century, were not Christians by conversion. They were Christians by birth. I've quoted a sociologist, Rodney Stark, a number of times in my talks. And his contention using sociological modeling and population modeling is that by the year 350, over 50% of the Roman Empire was Christian, which is an amazing thing considering that he begins in the year 100 with his belief that there were perhaps 7,500 Christians. It was a small fraction of 1%, and so of the population of the Roman Empire. So the expansion, the boom, if you will, of Christianity was amazing in a period of about 250 years. Okay. Augustine also understood Paul's Judaism as an inferior religion that Paul actually rejected. So Augustine came to the belief that Paul saw Judaism as an inferior religion to Christianity, and therefore Paul rejected it. And so Paul's letters came to be seen as critical of Judaism. We will see in a little while why that is really not the case. Okay. Now we fast forward to the 11th century, and we fast forward now about 500 years, and we look at Saint Anselm of Canterbury. I've mentioned Anselm of Canterbury before because his theology of atonement, his theology of what Jesus did by dying on the cross, has become pretty much the interpretation of the death and resurrection of Christ. But keep in mind, it's not original to the scriptures themselves. It is the product of a theologian who lived literally 1,000 years after Christ himself. Okay, so it is an evolution, and it is also an adaptation to the medieval, manorial, feudal system of its own time. So, as I've said, the traditional view among Christians today is that Christ saved humanity from damnation by dying and rising. In other words, that Jesus did the work of redemption, the work of salvation for us. And therefore there's nothing we can do to earn or to merit salvation. This understanding is more prominent among Protestants than it is among Catholics. But still, it is part of Catholic theology that we are saved by the grace of God. We are saved by what Jesus did for us. And so all we can do as believers is place our faith in what Christ has already done for us. That's the key phrase. So let me read a quote from St. Anselm's book. In Latin, the title is Cur Deus Homo. In English, Why Did God Become a Man? And so I keep tapping my phone because I'm timing this so that I don't keep you for 3 hours and 10 minutes. So anyway, in his book, Cur Deus Homo, Why Did God Become a Man? Anselm says this. Well, let me back up just a little bit. He's answering a question. The question that is the title of the book. Why did God become a human being? Why did God need to become a human? Why did God need to be incarnated? Why did God need to take on flesh in the person of Jesus? Why was that necessary? Here's Anselm's answer. Because of our disobedience to God, we are all sinners. Our disobedience to God, the disobedience of Adam. Forgiveness requires that compensation be made. For God to forgive sin without payment would imply that sin doesn't matter very much to God. Okay? So he's reflecting there the view of medieval times, that if one offended the Lord of the manor, that restitution was required. Okay? The price of our disobedience must be paid. But our debt to God as an infinite being is infinite. That's the key. Our debt to God, who is an infinite being, is infinite. We owe an infinite debt to God. Therefore, no one finite, that's us, no one finite can pay the price. Only an infinite being can pay an infinite debt. Only an infinite being can pay an infinite debt. That's why Jesus had to become, or that's why the Son of God, had to become a man. Thus, the necessity of Jesus. As the incarnation of God, he is that infinite being whose death as a substitutionary sacrifice for sin pays the price of our disobedience. Therefore, we can be forgiven. There it is. There is Anselm's theology known as substitutionary atonement. Okay? And this theology of substitutionary atonement became accepted by most Christians. Okay? That redemption, salvation was accomplished by Christ for us because we, as sinners, were utterly incapable of accomplishing it on our own. There was nothing we could do. We were doomed. We are doomed without the action of Christ, without Christ's death on the cross. Okay. That's substitutionary atonement. But and it's based on Paul. It's based on Anselm's interpretation of Paul. But I submit that and I'm not alone with this, I submit that that's an incorrect interpretation of the letters of Paul. So, what I am maintaining is this, that justification is not about our faith in Christ, but it's about the faithfulness of Christ himself. Let me explain that. So, justification is not about our faith in Christ. It is about Christ's faith in God. A faith and a love that would free him to surrender completely to God. To surrender to the point of death. Believing that God would avenge him, would be on his side. And that is, in fact, what happened in the resurrection. So, what Paul, I believe, and the scholars that I trust believe, what Paul is really saying is that we need to be active imitators of Christ. We need to mimic, we need to recreate, reenact Christ's faithfulness to God, just as Jesus was faithful to God his Father. So we need to do the same. We need to place our trust and our faith in God, that God will be with us and that God will, take care of us no matter what. We should be faithful to God and God's will, just as Jesus was faithful to God and God's will. Okay. That's my answer to the theology of substitutionary atonement. Okay. Let's now fast forward another almost 400 years to the time of Martin Luther. Okay. Martin Luther made the case for Paul's conversion experience even more strongly. He also made the case for Anselm's justification by faith even stronger. Okay? So, it's interesting. Just like Augustine and just like Paul, Luther had one of those boom conversion experiences, a transformative experience. In the case of Luther, he happened to be reading the letter to the Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 1, verse 17, which says, "For the righteousness of God is revealed in it from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live out of faith." So what did Luther understand when he read those words? Luther had been tormented. He had been extremely anxious and unsettled about the idea of the righteousness of God. Okay? Because Luther saw himself as a sinner whose attempts to be good, whose attempts to please God would never ever be enough. Okay? He believed that no matter how hard he tried, no matter what he did, God would never be pleased with his life. Luther believed for many years that God, at the last judgment would condemn him, and that tormented him for a long time. As a Benedictine monk, he was a Benedictine monk. Luther's discovery, and that's what he called it, a discovery, was that the righteousness of God, and this is what he found in the first chapter of the letter to the Romans, that the righteousness of God did not refer to God's own righteousness. It wasn't the righteousness of God himself, but to righteousness given to believers. The word that Luther used, and has been used by many Protestant denominations ever since, is that righteousness is imputed to us. It is imputed. It is given to us as an absolute gift. It's given to us as absolute grace. There is absolutely nothing that we can do to merit God's grace, and yet we receive it. We receive the righteousness of God, but only when we accept in faith what Jesus has done for us. Okay? And the phrase from Paul, the just shall live by faith, which is in the letter to the Romans, Luther saw as the true gate to paradise. And so Luther called his theology, or this part of his theology, justification by faith through grace. Okay? We become righteous. Righteousness is imputed to us, given to us freely. Nothing we can do to earn it. Okay. So Luther's reading of Paul went beyond even that of Augustine. Augustine had said that the death of Christ made believers righteous. But Augustine said, even though Jesus' death makes us righteous, we still have to perform good works. We still have to be good people. Okay? Luther took that one step further and said that Christ's death made believers righteous, and that works had nothing to do with it. One of his phrases was sola fide, faith alone. We are not saved by anything we can do. There is literally nothing that we can do. Mother Teresa's working in the streets of Calcutta, or you name it. There is nothing that anyone can do to earn salvation. So works have nothing to do with it. Our actions have nothing to do with it. Okay. Luther then went on to say that the law, in other words, the Torah, Mosaic law, and he went so far as to say not just Jewish law, Torah law, but also civil law, okay, was not the way to live a life worthy of God. Why? Because the law, both civil law and religious law, is embodied in the Torah, only shows us just how sinful we really are. And so, because of original sin, doesn't matter if we follow the law, it doesn't matter if we follow religious law, civil law, it doesn't matter. We are doomed without accepting in faith the gift of redemption given to us by Christ. We have to recognize our utter dependence on God and trust that God has done what we cannot do for ourselves. Okay. Still, at the end of the day, after all of this, righteousness is only imputed even after we accept salvation in Christ. Even after we embrace what Christ has done for us, we are still sinners. There is an image in one of Luther's writings where he talks about humanity as a dung heap. And he says the action of Christ in his death and resurrection is like a blanket of snow over that dung heap. So we are We are made righteous. We are made clean. We are made pure. But underneath that layer of snow is still a dung heap. And so even after we accept the gift of redemption from Christ, we are still sinners. We are, from day one till the end of our lives, always sinners. Okay. And because of Luther, this justification by faith became really one of the central, or came to be understood rather, as one of the central tenets of Paul's theology. Okay? So, by this time, Paul had become thoroughly Christianized. His connection with Judaism was absolutely severed, absolutely cut off. And remember, that's important because of the theme that I'm discussing throughout this little talk today. I'm talking about the Jewishness of Paul. So what I'm trying to do here is recover for us, bring back to our minds just how Jewish Paul is. Christian, but Jewish. Okay, let's just take a quick look now. I wish I could open the floor to questions, but I can't hear you if you ask a question, so I'm going to have to move on. So let's take a look here at the Judaism of Paul's time. I've already characterized it somewhat. I've said that it's Hellenistic Judaism, it's influenced by Greek ideas, and I've also said that it is Second Temple Judaism. It is the Judaism of that time from after the exile until the second destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Hellenism, amazingly, it was not destroyed by when Jerusalem was, and it lasted for several centuries later, and it was only replaced in the 7th century by the thinking of Islam. So Islamic philosophy became more dominant in the Middle East and the Mediterranean by that time. Okay, so Paul's views, now we're starting to talk more about the Judaism of Paul, how Paul is Jewish. Paul's views were consistent with the views of Hellenistic Judaism, both before and after Damascus. Okay? So first of all, his idea of God. Paul's idea of God is thoroughly Jewish. He believes in a single God. He is a monotheist. He believes in a single God whose image or likeness cannot be depicted. Remember, that's something that comes from Old Testament Judaism, that there shall be no graven image of God. That's one of the commandments in one of the sets of the commandments in the Old Testament. So Paul embraces that. That's called, and here's a word you can share at the next social distancing party, it's called aniconic monotheism. Aniconic. The God who, this one God cannot be depicted in any kind of image. Okay? What were Paul's views about temple? Before I get into what Paul's views were on temple, let me talk about the significance of the temple in the first century, during the time of Paul. As I said, it was the end of the Second Temple period. By this time, the temple is seen as extremely important to Jewish identity. But keep this in mind as well. By this time, not many Jews actually go to the temple. Rather, they would go to synagogue. I mean, it would be quite a journey to go from Galilee all the way to Jerusalem, to the temple. It was not easy. It was also dangerous. So, by this time, many Jews did not go to temple by mid-1st century, sorry. And by this time, the synagogue was coming to be seen as a place not just of prayer and study, but also as a place of worship. Okay? Third element of Hellenistic Judaism that are consistent with Paul, and that is the idea of idolatry, the idea of a God that can be depicted as a statue or a picture or an icon, some form like that. Okay? So Jewish monotheism, as I've already said, rejected all forms of idolatry, all forms of any other god besides their God. Still, during this time, there is plenty of evidence. There's plenty of evidence in the literature of the time that the Jews were tolerant of the polytheism of the Gentiles. Okay? So even though their belief system was very strict about monotheism, they were, in fact, there's plenty of evidence to believe that they were quite tolerant of the polytheism of the pagans and Gentiles around them. Okay. What about the idea of Torah, the idea of the law? By the first century, Torah referred to more than just the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. It referred to the totality of Jewish law. It referred to the totality of Jewish Scripture and law. All of God's words to His people. Okay? So Torah, by this time, had become a shorthand term for the covenant relationship between God and God's people. That was the meaning of Torah. Okay? Further, this covenant relationship singled out the Jewish people as God's elect. Okay? They were seen as God's chosen people. And so Torah applied only to Israel. It made Israel, to quote the Hebrew Scriptures, a priestly kingdom, a holy nation, a people set apart. They were God's chosen people. Okay? God's uniquely chosen people. Further, the covenant between God and the Jewish people was seen as permanent and unbreakable. So the Jewish people might violate the covenant to the point where God would punish them, as God had done in the exile. But the covenant could not and would not be broken. The covenant was seen as eternal, and God would never, ever abandon His people. Okay? This is all by way of background to show how Paul, I'll get there, to show how Paul's message is a Jewish message. Okay? So, another part of Hellenistic Judaism, and Paul would have embraced this, that the moral commands of the covenant, okay, the moral commands of the covenant, the commandments, were seen to apply both to Jews and to Gentiles. It didn't matter whether you were actually a Jew. Those were universal commandments. But the purity laws, and keep in mind that first century Israel and Judah were a purity society. So there were a number of reasons, circumstances that might make one impure. Childbirth would make one impure. To touch a corpse would make one impure. Leprosy made one impure. Okay? So there was a whole system of purity laws in place. Laws that Jesus Himself violated on many occasions. All right. Among those purity laws were circumcision and the kosher laws, the dietary laws, the laws about food. But it was believed at that time that those laws applied only to Jews. Gentiles did not have to practice circumcision. Gentiles did not have to practice kosher. And remember in the talk from last week where Paul got into a dispute with the other apostles on those 2 points, on circumcision and kosher laws. And he said, no, it's not necessary for Gentile Christian Jews, Gentiles who become Christians and Christian Jews, to practice circumcision or to practice kosher. Okay? It was necessary for them to practice Torah. It was not necessary for them to practice the purity laws, circumcision or kosher. Okay? All right. Now, what was the understanding of redemption and salvation in Hellenistic Second Temple Judaism? this understanding of salvation and redemption, again, would have been something that Paul would have accepted and embraced. Okay? So, in Hellenistic Judaism, salvation was viewed as it was viewed as corporate and communal, rather than, or far more than, individual. Okay? So, Israel so believed first century Jews. Israel would be saved as a nation, and the Jews would be saved as a people. And so apocalyptic theology at the time held that the Jewish people there would be a resurrection of the Jewish people. They believed that they were living in the beginning of the end times. Okay, that God was about to change things in Israel, that God was about to restore God's sovereignty in Israel. And so salvation, the redemption of the Jews, was seen as a corporate, national, communal thing. All right? All right, so the idea of redemption or salvation also was understood. It was also understood that the commandments, the Torah, was to be followed out of love for God. Okay? In other words, people were expected to do good things. There was not this dichotomy of faith versus works. Those who were believers showed their belief by the things that they did. This is simply a picking up of the ideas of the prophets, among others. Remember, it was the prophets who reminded the Jewish people over and over again that their worship meant nothing to God, that God rejected their worship if they did not follow it up with the work of justice, that their worship was meaningless to God, it was empty, unless they also took care of the poor and the widows and the orphans among them. And that belief carries on into first century Second Temple Hellenistic Judaism. Okay? So to sum this all up, and I know this is, it's kind of detailed and I'm kind of down in the weeds, so I apologize for that, but this is all kind of setting the stage, I hope, for what becomes a somewhat clear explanation of the Jewishness of Paul. In short, then, salvation was seen as living the covenant, participating in the covenant with one's body, mind, soul, and spirit. And Paul's understanding of salvation, redemption, covenant reflects this. Okay? Next element of Hellenistic Judaism has to do with their attitude toward the Gentiles. So in Paul's time, Gentiles were not rejected. They weren't demonized. In fact, many Jews were surprisingly open to non-Jews. In everyday life, many times Jews and non-Jews interacted and socialized and did all kinds of things together. Even at that time, even in the time of strict purity laws, it was not a violation of the purity laws for a Jew to come in contact with a Gentile. Surprisingly, okay? One of my authors said that by Paul's time, Jews and Gentiles looked so much alike that they were practically indistinguishable one from another. The only way to tell a Jew from a Gentile was A, if the Jew hung out with other Jews, okay? B, if they practiced kosher and observed Sabbath, kosher and Sabbath, then you could tell they were a Jew and not a Gentile. And for the males, circumcision, obviously. And it went so far that at this time, it was understood that the Torah did not even forbid intermarriage between Jews and Gentiles. The Torah does, talk about, it talks about how unacceptable it is for a Jew to marry a non-Jew. By the time of Paul, this is not the case. Jews and Gentiles are intermarrying all the time. There's no problem with this. Okay? All of this is to say, by way of background, that Paul's frequent interactions with Gentiles is not something that would have been condemned by the Jews as is depicted in the Acts of the Apostles. Okay? Paul's interaction with Jews would not have been seen as out of the ordinary in any way. Okay, now, I am 46 minutes into this conversation, or this monologue, I should say. Where do we see the Jewishness of Paul? I'm going to take my time in going through this because it's a little bit complicated. So I hope you don't leave me at this point. So, first of all, where do we see the Jewishness of Paul in the Damascus experience? If it wasn't an experience of conversion, if it was not Paul's radical, about-face conversion from Judaism to Christianity, then what exactly was it? There are scholars now who are saying that Paul's Damascus experience was not an experience of conversion, but rather an experience or a call to Paul's new vocation. Just as Abraham's calling was changed over time, so Paul's calling, his vocation, was changed as a result of the Damascus experience. And one of the indications of that is, as we know, Paul's name changed. He had been known prior to this time as Saul. Now he becomes known as Paul. Remember, a change in name, Abram to Abraham, it is the sign of a change in one's calling or vocation. And what is that change in his call? His calling is changed from being a persecutor of Gentiles to being the apostle to the Gentiles. Okay, that's a pretty radical change, isn't it? So, let's keep in mind that by the time of the Damascus experience, Christianity in no way, shape, or form is a new religion on its own. It is simply a sect of Judaism. And so when Paul converts to Christ, he is converting to a new way of being a Jew. In the letter to the Philippians, chapter 3, verses 2 to 9, Paul, in talking about his life after Damascus, he says this, and this is a quote. He says, I was circumcised on the 8th day, an Israelite, a Hebrew, and a Pharisee. And when he says these things, he's speaking in the present tense. He does not say, I was a Hebrew, an Israelite, a Pharisee. He says, I am a Hebrew, an Israelite, a Pharisee. Okay? So what this means is that in these verses, Paul is describing himself as both a Pharisee and a Christian, a follower of Christ and a Pharisee. So the conversion that Paul experienced on the road to Damascus is not from one religion to another. It is a conversion from being a persecutor of Christians to being an apostle. Let me back up. I'll say it again. His conversion was from being a persecutor of Gentiles to being the apostle to the Gentiles. Okay? So then we have to back up and ask the question, why would Paul have wanted to persecute the Christians in the first place? Well, probably he would have wanted to persecute them because they were a political threat to Rome. And so as a Pharisee, Paul would not have wanted to rock the boat politically. The Pharisees were in cahoots with the Romans, and that's what spared them. And so Paul would, as a Pharisee, would not have wanted to rock that boat. If the Romans wanted the Christians persecuted, by God, he's going to do it. He will persecute them. Okay. So why did then Paul become a victim of persecution himself? And it's because, not because of the Jews, it was because his attitude toward Rome changed. Not his attitude toward Jews, but his attitude toward Rome. His attitude toward Rome became one of defiance and resistance as a result of the Damascus experience. And that's why he would have been persecuted. Okay? So the Acts of the Apostles distorts that. They say that the Acts of the Apostles says that Paul was persecuted by the Jews. Paul himself will say that he was persecuted by the Romans. Okay. So then if you look at the first chapter of the letter to the Galatians and also the third chapter of the letter to the Philippians, you will see that Paul uses the Damascus experience not to say he was converted, but to defend his calling and his credibility as an apostle. Remember, he says, I'm not one of the original 12, but I am an apostle. And why did he make the claim that he had become an apostle? He made that claim because he said he had seen Christ. That is the Damascus experience. And because of the Damascus experience, he said, I too am an apostle. Even though I never saw Christ while he was on earth, he says, I have seen Christ, and therefore I have become an apostle, just like the rest of you guys. And my special calling is to be an apostle to the Gentiles. Okay? I hope that's understandable. This is another one of those moments where I see hands going up, and yes, Allison, did you have a question? Oh, well, sorry. Okay, we have to move on. We will get back together, even if we have to meet out on a football field and separate our chairs. We will get together and do this again. All right. So that's the first point. Second point. Where's the second place we can see Paul's Jewishness? We can see it in his mission to the Gentiles. Okay? Paul was of the belief that the Gentiles should convert from their pagan idolatry and come to believe in the one God of Israel. Okay? Paul also objected to the observance of Torah on the part of the Gentiles. Paul believed that because of his experience of Christ, it was no longer necessary for the Gentiles to become Jews. Even though Paul himself remained one, he remained a Jew, he did not think it was necessary for the Gentiles to convert to Judaism. They could become Gentile Christians. Okay? Okay, so Paul, at the same time, Paul says that Jesus did not do away with Torah. It's not that the Torah has been overcome by Christ or done away with by Christ. It's just that the Gentiles don't have to follow it. Here's what he said. This is a quote from the third chapter of the letter to the Romans. Quote, "Do we render Torah void? God forbid. On the contrary, we uphold the Torah." So, how do we in other places, Paul makes negative comments about the Torah, and how can we account for those? First of all, remember that his views about Torah are addressed to Gentiles. When he says that, quote, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law in Galatians chapter 3, verse 13, he means that Christ has removed the curse imposed upon the Gentiles by the Jews. Hello there, Maddo. Yes. Do you have any questions? Oh, you're going to sit in. Okay, good. When Paul says that Christ has removed the curse imposed upon the Gentiles, he's referring to that curse which is found in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 26, which said, "Cursed be anyone who does not uphold the words of this law," the Torah, by observing them. Paul said Christ lifted that curse from the Gentiles. So therefore, the Gentiles are not bound by the observance of Torah or by the purity laws. They are not bound by circumcision. They're not bound by the kosher laws. They're not bound by the observance of Sabbath. And one of the reasons why they are not is because time is running short. Paul, consistent with the post-exilic prophets and consistent with first century Judaism, believes that the end is on its way. That Christ is about to return very soon. So there is no time for Gentiles to observe Torah. There is no need, therefore, for Gentiles to observe Torah. So the bottom line is this for Paul, that it is Christ who is God's way. It's Christ that is God's way of bringing the Gentiles into God's family. It is Christ who makes the Gentiles part of God's family, not Torah. Does that make sense? Okay. Still, Paul wants the Gentiles to be part of God's family. He wants them, they are part of the chosen people. But not by their observance of Torah, not by circumcision, kosher laws, Sabbath, but by their acceptance of Christ and their living according to Christ's way. So Paul, being a first century Hellenistic Jew, has an apocalyptic vision. He believes that the end times are upon us. And those end times specifically mean that God is calling all the nations to himself. When he says this, Paul is merely echoing what the post-exilic prophets said. And the post-exilic prophets believed that eventually God would call all the nations to serve the God of Israel. That all the nations would worship in Jerusalem, that all the nations would worship at the temple, and all nations would be under the sovereignty of God. Okay, so Paul is merely echoing that vision of the post-exilic prophets. Paul believed that the end of the age was near. Remember who else believed that? Jesus himself believed that. Okay? That the reign of God was about to be restored through Christ, who was the Messiah. And Paul wanted to bring the nations, meaning the Gentiles, to that awareness that the end was near. For Paul, it was time for, quote, all the nations, which means all the Gentiles, to acknowledge the God of Israel as the God of the universe. Remember a couple weeks ago, maybe it's a couple months ago, I made that statement that Paul refers to our Lord also as the Lord. And our Lord, the Lord of the Jewish people, is the Lord. the Lord of the universe. And so Paul believed that it was now time for the Gentiles, or the nations, same thing, to acknowledge the God of Israel as their God, as the God of the universe. And so it was time for them to reject their polytheism, to reject their idolatry, and accept the God of Israel. So, there are two elements, though, of Paul's apocalyptic, eschatological vision that were radical, that were different. First of all, he said that the eschaton, the end of the age, would be an age. It would not be an instant. In other words, it was not one of those, here it is. This is before the eschaton. This is the eschaton. No, it would be gradual. It was an age. In other words, the eschaton would be in time and in history. It would not be the end of time itself. It would not mark the end of history. The eschaton, the reign of God, would take place on this earth, entirely consistent with the message of Jesus. And second, the eschaton would be a cooperative venture. It would be a cooperative venture between God and humanity. It would not be the work of God alone. Remember what I said about Jesus' reign of God movement. That one of the things that made it so different, that made it radical, was that it was not that God was going to come down and swoop down and get rid of the Romans and establish himself as the sovereign of Israel. No, rather, it would only happen when God's people made it a reality, when God's people made the reign of God a reality. Paul is saying the same thing, that the end of times, the eschaton, is here on earth, and it's a cooperative venture between God and God's people, and that the Gentiles were involved in this. So Paul, in a way, no, not in a way, Paul is universalizing the eschaton. He is saying that it applies not just to Israel, but that it applies to the nations, that it applies to all people throughout the world. Okay. Paul also believed that Jesus was divine, that Jesus was God's equal. Okay? But he did not, he accepted the divinity of Christ in the way that Judaism in its time understood it. Okay, so for Paul, it was God who is in charge of life and death. It is God who is the keeper of the keys of life and death. And so Jesus did not raise himself from the dead. Paul tells us that it was God who raised Jesus from the dead. Entirely consistent with Jewish theology. Second, Paul said that it was God who gave Jesus a new, immortal, and eschatological body. Okay? Paul said that it was God, consistent with Judaism of his time, that God gave Jesus the authority to preside over the process of redemption. And those to whom Jesus appeared were called to help all people realize that the eschaton had arrived. That God was to be recognized as the Lord of the universe. Okay. So for Paul, and this is why Paul would have come to be persecuted by the Romans. For Paul to proclaim Jesus as the Lord is to proclaim God as the Lord. And what does that mean? When to proclaim Jesus as Lord, and therefore to proclaim the God of Israel as Lord, is to say what? Is to say that the emperor, the Roman emperor, is not the Lord. Okay? So, Paul is saying that Jesus is God's equal, but it's noteworthy at the same time that Paul never refers to Jesus as God. In Greek, theos. You will not find in the writings of Paul that Jesus is theos, that Jesus is God's ontological equal. For Paul, Jesus is always subordinate to God. He is not God's equal in being. So Jesus' divinity is functional. I've discussed this before. I'll say it again. Jesus' divinity, according to Paul, is functional. What that means is that Jesus can do the things that God does. Not that Jesus is the equal of God in being, but that Jesus is the equal of God in function. Jesus can do the things that God does. He can walk on water. He can raise people from the dead. He can multiply loaves and fishes. He can cure. He can do the things that God does. Okay? So he is divine. He is divine in his function, not divine in his being. It won't be until the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century where the understanding of Jesus' divinity is seen in ontological terms. Okay? That they are equal in being. Consubstantial. Homoousios. One in being, as we say every Sunday in the Creed. Okay. So, for Paul, the coming of Christ is the beginning of the end. Okay? Not the end of history. Not the end of the world. But it is the beginning of the end of Roman domination. Just as Jesus had said. Okay? The end of the world was near. In other words, history was about to begin a new phase. There was the beginning of a new age. A new time. So, for Paul, he understood his call from Christ. He understood his vocation to be the apostle to the Gentiles. To let them know that the end was near, the end of the prior age was near, and that it was time for them to worship the one true God of all the nations. And that one true God of all the nations is the God of Israel. It was time to unite the Gentiles with God's family. It was time for the Gentiles to become part of God's chosen people. Paul believed that God's chosen people included not just Jews but also Gentiles, but that the Gentiles were to worship the God of Israel. Entirely Jewish, right? Okay. So Paul felt that the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham was near. God had promised that Abraham would be what? The father of many nations. And so Paul saw his mission as bringing the Gentiles, the people of the nations, into the family of Abraham. To make them part of God's chosen people. You see how Jewish that is? Okay. Last point. There is a common misperception about salvation. And it's one that was fostered both by Augustine and by Luther. That question is, how can I be saved? That salvation is strictly personal. But the question that Paul would have asked would have been a very different question. His question would have been, how will the world be saved? You can see that from what I was just saying about Paul believing that it's time for him to reach out to the nations, to the Gentiles. Paul's question would have been, how will the world be saved? And his other question was, how can I participate in that salvation? Or another way of phrasing the question, how will God reconcile all people to himself? How will God reconcile Jews, and Gentiles, so that all can be of one family. I've already discussed this, but I'm going to bring it up again. Paul's answer to this question goes back to the Old Testament prophets, in particular the prophets of the post-exilic times, the prophets after the Babylonian exile. And it has to do with their concept of what is known as the ingathering of nations. The time when all the nations would come together and live in harmony and peace. If you look at Isaiah chapter 49, verse 6, or if you look at the 60th chapter of Isaiah, or if you look at Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 10, if you look at those verses, you will see that in the view of Isaiah and Jeremiah, the nations would stand before God. All nations, two things here. All nations would stand before the God of Israel. That the God of Israel would be the God of all the nations, and that they would stand before God as nations and not as individual persons. Okay, so the concept in post-exilic prophetism about salvation was that ultimately all people would stand before the God of Israel, and that they would all stand before the God of Israel as nations and not as individual persons. That's the message of Paul. He's picking up on that message of the Old Testament and bringing it forward. But he's saying that in Christ, it is Christ who would help bring that about. It is Christ who would bring all the nations, Gentiles and Jews, to God. And so that all people would worship the one God of Judaism. And that Paul, once again, saw his mission as his function as bringing the nations, the Gentiles, to the God of Israel. So for Paul, the death and resurrection of Jesus signals the start of this ingathering of nations. Okay? When the Gentiles would give up their false gods and would return to the God, or not return, but would turn to the God of Israel. And Paul says, once the Gentiles have come into the family, have come into the fold, then, quote, all Israel will be saved. See what he's doing? He's greatly expanding the idea of Israel. He's greatly expanding the idea of covenant. He's greatly expanding, he's universalizing the concept of the people of God. So for Paul, salvation is expansive. It is even universal. Okay? But this does not mean that the Jews had to convert to Christianity. Okay? Christianity never superseded or did away with Judaism for Paul. From beginning to end, his vision was Jewish. So there you have it. I hope that's clear. Maybe what we need to do is when we all get back together, we need just kind of a little synopsis of this, a kind of review of this little talk, so that we can have some questions and answers and some discussion. This is not easy material, but I think it's material that's very, very important for us to understand in order to have a correct understanding of Paul and his message and its implications for us now. So this is the end of our series on Paul. The next series that I'm planning is on the history of the Mass. The history of the Mass is quite interesting, as you might imagine. I've been, over the last couple of months, been able to do quite a bit of reading about it. It's going to take a little bit of time for me to put together my notes about it, but by the time we all get back together, and even if it does take a while for us to get back together, Maybe I'll have to do it this same way, but we will next talk about the history of the Mass. Once again, thank you for watching. Thank you for participating. I can't wait to get back to St. Nick's. I miss you all. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Thanks a lot. Take care.